Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Cloudbusters. I'm Alex Huller, and I'm joined as ever by my co-host Mallory Bedreau. This week, we've actually got a really exciting special guest joining us all the way from Google. Who do we have, Mallory, joining us this week?
Yes, we are thrilled to welcome John Enoch here today to talk about cloud cost management, also known as FinOps. Today, we're going to talk about where organizations are being successful and how. We're going to talk about the challenges around cloud cost management and how to address them. Now, John has specialized in technology cost and risk management for over 20 years. We've got a veteran on the line today. He has a patent in compliance recording analysis, and he currently is a customer success manager for digital natives at Google Cloud. So, John, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your background and your experience before we get started today?
Actually, Mallory, before we get into the background, can we talk about your actual background, John? Because you look like you're in a museum or something here. It looks fantastic.
Right. Well, I'm very fortunate that Google has located me to Sweden, and I'm currently in my basement, which is the last remaining part of a 14th century monastery, which is under the hill in a place called Mariefred. And behind me, the hole there is the original entrance to the monastery from the waterfront. And it's also featured in the Pax books, which are kind of like Harry Potter books in Sweden. And that would be the entrance to the magical library that the forces of good and evil are fighting over, otherwise known as my home office.
Okay, that's a pretty awesome home office, John.
Bravo. So today it's the forces of good and evil in cloud cost management. Off to a great start.
John, could you give us a bit of an idea of what you think has changed over the last 10 to 20 years as we get into is in the IT cost management space?
What's changed? I think it's more a case of what stayed the same. Now, I am not as old as the background behind me, but I do remember getting into the telecom industry in the early 90s and working in things like telex. Now, I've then moved on to things like mobile and then things like cloud. And what I've seen is there's a lot of commonality in these services. So cloud billing has a mixture of monthly transactions and fixed pricing. It's multi-tenanted and it uses quite standardized contracts. So I'm sorry, that sounds very much like mobile phones and phone calls. And I'm sorry, going back to telex. So I think we might actually expect that the more traditional companies could have a base of tooling, precedents, processes, and maturity that they could apply to cloud that perhaps they don't realize or think about at the moment. There's a lot of things we can learn from. A lot of these traditional companies will have already gone through a similar process of cloud cost management when they've gone through phone calls, when they've gone through mobile phone contracts, whatever it happens to be. But I would say that ideally, the cost management system should be framed in terms of a control to a risk in the risk register. Because if you do it in that way, you're making cloud cost management a governance issue. You're not making it a how can we save a penny on the dollar or something that gets lost in the roundings. You're making it about the quality of management of the organization. It is part of the risk profile. And in that basis, I think it gets the right kind of attention. If we go now to what has changed, I would say that cloud technology, as going back to mobile phones was the same, it makes the IT spend far less predictable unless it's properly managed. So for example, there's a Gartner stat that I think it's about 80% of organizations will overshoot their infrastructure as a service budget due to their lack of cloud financial management practices. And I would almost guarantee, I can't reference it, but I would almost guarantee that if you went back to the early 2000s, late 90s or something, you would find the same kind of stats out there for mobile phones.
John, actually, it's really interesting hearing you use that kind of mobile phone type analogy. I feel like that works kind of incredibly well when you think of public cloud. We have the calls we make and the minutes we use and the types of call, our different types of usage, but also how we manage that plan that we have, the commitment we have with our mobile phone provider, and those
Mm.
discounting mechanisms kind of work in exactly the same way in public cloud. And it's a really great analogy. John, just thinking about kind of your comment on that Gartner stat around 80% of organizations overshooting their infrastructure as a service budget. Why do you think this happens? Is there something folks can do to kind of avoid this?
Absolutely. I think the reason why this type of problem happens, and it's the same with many problems that you find in organizations, it's about how they make decisions. So organization today is the sum total of its decisions, right? Just like we are. So you have to think of cloud a little differently or you get the wrong result. And the thing with cloud is it's around making balanced trade-offs. You're not going to get the perfect solution on cost or on service quality or range of services or whatever. There's always going to be a trade-off. And the issue that a lot of organizations get wrong is the way in which they manage trade-offs. They usually don't have a process. I very rarely see they have a structured process. It's quite cultural. So what they'll do is if they're going to drive agility, they will degrade centralized controls. If they're going to drive cost out, they're going to strengthen up centralized controls, which kills agility. So what they tend to do is they treat decisions as having one big dominant objective, like cost out or innovation in, and then all other objectives just become constraints. Now, this is absolutely a dreadful way to make decisions. So when you do that, you end up with problems, and they are very avoidable. So I would say cloud management, especially cloud cost management, is those informed trade-offs, and you need a structure for trade-offs. And this has been around since Noah. It's called decision analysis. I did my master's in this, and it can be quite interesting. What I think is an interesting, example of a company which I see getting this very much right is actually Spotify. So with Spotify, I can see that they have a culture that's very cost conscious, but really prizes innovation and attracts people based on their technology brand. So they tend to trust their engineers to do the right thing. They provide them with lots of information. That's a really good starting point for getting it right, is to make sure that people see that they have ownership of the company's results and that they have they have a sentiment of care towards doing the right thing. One thing I would say though also is there's no consensus on tooling. So I think about that FinOps Foundation survey said that about 60% of the market is using services like Aptio and its peers, but about 25%, like Spotify, develop their own things. There's no sort of right way of doing it. It's about working out what your options are, what counts as success, and then structuring your decision making to ensure that you have enough support to make it happen and that you have eliminated the bad options as much as picking the one that you want.
What's changed in cost management, the attitudes towards it, the awareness of it in that time?
Okay, I think more organizations have got past seeing cloud as outsourcing. More and more organizations are seeing cloud as a business tool that enables results which are fundamental to the health of the business. It's IT as a real differentiator. And I think the awareness of that is coming through far more. So we're seeing far more awareness of the need for cloud cost management and the complexity that it involves. So, for example, I often get questions within Google around how do we get better control of our costs, and what sort of tooling should we use? Now, a few years back, when I first started doing these calls with Cloudability Aptio, it was common to see spreadsheet wrangling as the go-to tooling approach, or IT operations developing their own tools in isolation. And back then, cloud customers would mainly want to know about the service provider tooling that's free or low cost or comes with the service. And some of the really quick wins like reservations and the rest of it, simple stuff, tagging. But now we're seeing the conversations around cloud cost management becoming far more fundamental and far more likely to involve a conversation with finance. Whereas previously, I think FinOps has been very much IT ops and very little finance. If I look at Sky, they have a very clear vision for cloud cost management, and their vision is that all users are payers. It's all driven by accountability. I think that's wonderful. And what they've done is they have two approaches. So they've developed a tool using Google BigQuery and Looker that pulls in billing data and generates trend analysis and gives all of these users a bill to pay. And they've really joined the dots between IT ops and IT finance. And I think achieving that cloud cost accountability, that cultural thing, is a major leap forward that they've come to. But not only that, they've also taken a risk approach. And rather than just developing one thing, they also use one of the software as a service tools. So that means that they're always focused on the prize as a finance and ops team, and they could plan for the future without distraction and biases around tooling. They're thinking about agility, saving money, and making sure that their risks are managed. So they're in a really good spot.
So John, actually, you've given us some really interesting kind of customer examples there, and what folks are, what some of the folks you see are working with are doing to manage kind of public cloud cost. I've got to ask then, why do you think customers struggle with cost management in the cloud?
That's a really good question. I think we look at some of the things that happen when they interact with cloud providers. So they'll interact with the cloud provider, maybe they'll tie in some big discount with some sort of contract based on usage, and then things kind of stall, because nothing happens, and that doesn't help anybody. Everyone loses in that situation, and cloud cost management, I think, is a major part of that failure to execute. So, if we look at, for example, the annual, one of my favorite, non-fiction reads, the Standish Group's annual chaos report. It looks at the likelihood that projects will succeed or not succeed, and it comes to a success rate of just over 30%, and less than half of that 30% delivers significant value. So statistically, if an organization is doing any major software change, they are statistically more likely to fail than to succeed. It's a sad fact. So we have to actually ask the question why, or we just end up repeating this. I recently had a call with a telco where it was IT ops, finance, and the procurement team, and they wanted to talk about my thoughts on FinOps. And most of the questions they were coming up with were talking about, how do we migrate? How do we work out the landing zone? What tooling should we use? It was all about how. It's all about jumping in. There was very, very little attention being given to the decision of, why are we doing this, and what's the best way to make that decision?
Yeah.
So my advice to them was to, first of all, step back a bit and start by documenting everything into a one-page or maybe two-page summary that's simple to understand for everybody, so you can get some consensus. And then also make sure that you've got a senior level sponsor who's prepared to, stand up and make things happen. When you've got that, then you can start going into the question of, why are we moving to the cloud, which is ultimately the thing that will build the consensus and the attention on helping you do the how. And when you do that, you can start thinking about, what are the success measures that are relevant? And I also think it's very important to think in terms of a range of possible options and which one is the least bad or, the best, and not think in terms of the only possible outcome is success. Because Standish Group shows it is absolutely not. The most probable outcome is failure. So everything else you're doing is mitigating risk. And to do that, you need people to work together.
John, you said the word of the day. You said FinOps in that previous explanation. So let's go there. Let's talk about it. But first, let's define the term. So what do you understand the term FinOps to mean?
I have a really good one, because you should always start with making sure you have the common understanding of language before talking about something. Yeah. So in my view, FinOps is part of that governance jigsaw. FinOps is about looking at your existing controls that you have around, IT maybe for 20, 30 years, and you're going to look at areas that are going to be impacted by change, like forecasting, budgeting, and being able to close the books each month. These are very fundamental capabilities that easily degrade when cloud is adopted at scale without proper planning and training. And in my view, FinOps, as I mentioned, it's more governance than anything. It's to mitigate that control slippage. There has to be a real focus on cloud economics. Too often, I see FinOps teams just zeroing in on how do I do reservations? What's my tagging policy? What can I do to automate things going on and off? All of which is absolutely fundamental and required, but it's not top of the tree. All right, so top of the tree is governance. One down from that, I think we're looking at cloud economics. So for cloud economics, you're not looking so much at bend the curve, how do we reduce the cost by optimization when you talk FinOps. What you're really looking at is, you're really looking at unit economics. You're trying to think, what is the fully burdened cost of creating a relevant unit? Something which is fundamental. The old economics view of inputs and outputs. What does a company fundamentally produce? So it might be monthly active users. It might be a cost per stream. It might be many things. But can you come to a unit that you think is relevant, that you can associate cost and revenue to? Because if you can, then you can actually say what value you got from your IT, especially cloud. So you should be able to correlate a dollar spent on cloud to some variable such as revenue growth or product success rate or something that tells you that you're doing a good job. In my view, that's what cloud economics is. And down from that, you have FinOps, next layer. I view it like a pyramid. And that middle of the pyramid, FinOps, is bending the curve. That's really operational effectiveness. How do you get the most for your money? Flatten that cost curve. You're going to need a process with finance, operation, and users all combined. And there has to be some tooling to automate, make it simple, and ensure that data ends up in one place and usable. So that for me is the FinOps bit. It's bending the curve. At the foundation of it all is billing data. So you're always going to have with cloud cost management a garbage in, garbage out dependency. So service providers have to provide a level of granularity and API access to billing data that enables the cloud cost management of FinOps, which enables the unit economics view that supports that spend being a good thing.
How would any cloud customer know if they have a potentially a big problem in this area? Because you mentioned there's a lot of there's governance, there's elements of having the right metadata. But what would be the thing that they would identify to say, oh, I need to improve this?
Well, I think the early signs are a lot of problems around allocating costs, closing the books, and being able to forecast. Those are sort of the fundamentals that you got something to worry about, and there will be little surprises that come along. But when it's too late is when a group of most likely DevOps engineers are building loads of wonderful things on cloud, racking up a bill, and then they get a call from IT finance saying, you just blew 3 years of our OPEX, you're going to stop this. At that point, I think everyone loses. So it is incredibly important to look at those early signs and look at those surprises and to think, do we have waste? So my advice is to document what you have going wrong at the moment in terms of your management of cost in cloud, separate them into categories, and then involve the IT risk team so that you're trying to make cloud cost management a controls issue and part of governance, because then it becomes something that everybody takes seriously. So governance usually is a must-have and it gets funding. So my view is that you need to try to measure waste, and you need to look for surprises, and you need to think, rather than these surprises continuing, maybe we should start documenting and asking why these are happening. Think of a system. The big danger is that unless you do have a clear plan and a budget for tools and controls, then cloud spend can become a free-for-all.
Now, John, that was good advice, and you've talked a lot about really successful organizations. Now, for the early stage adopters or migrators, what additional advice might you give them as they're getting started?
I think love your IT ops people. Make sure that IT ops has some support, and if IT ops is on its own, it should never stand alone. So don't make cloud cost management something that belongs to IT ops in isolation, or you will end up with an interface with lots of graphs that tells you nothing. Cloud cost management is a team sport. There needs to be shared risk across all stakeholders. And that's why I always start with, there's 1 or 2 page summary of the decision with a problem statement, a list of how you would measure success in an outcome, the available options and what they mean, and what you see as the dependencies. And when you put that together, you can drive some support around this so that IT ops does not stand alone. It's interesting when we look at what Sky has done, in that their insistence that users have to be payers, it's kind of anchored cloud cost management in their business culture. And I really think that's an example of how it's done.
Do you have any other examples or stories of what the kind of super users do correctly? Like what did they do right with FinOps?
I think that when I look at super users, I've mentioned 2 in this talk, Sky and Spotify. I would say it's that they're realists. They know that success is not the only outcome, and they talk to each other a lot. They have a lot of collaboration strengths. So they're not top down. They're very flat in the way they communicate. And I think what they get right is that they have diversity of thought. They do not do groupthink. They do teamwork. And through that, executives, I think, have a far greater comfort factor that vision can be executed. So that's where I spoke about unit economics. I will only hear that term coming from the super users.
What support should those users expect from a service provider such as Google when they're doing this? What help can they get?
You need to make cloud cost management the intersection between operations strategy and risk management. It needs to be something new, and I think that's what your cloud cost management investments are there to deliver.
It's been a really awesome kind of deep dive with you today on kind of your experience of working with clients in public cloud and their cloud adoption journeys. I guess, Mallory, I didn't know if you had one of these this week or not, but do you happen to have a cloud ahead of the week for this? I'm trying to think.
I have a hat for you. Walk with me, team. So today we've heard some really great stories of digital natives and super users and what they do right. So these are sort of like cream of the crop. They're, the darlings of the cloud world. They're the belle of the ball. Belle of the ball, you say. Well, I happen to have a bell-shaped hat.
What?
Took me a minute, but it's my bell-shaped hat for the bells of the ball. Whoo! John, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure chatting with you. If people want to get in touch, how can they reach out to you?
Well, I think either go through ideally go through your Google account manager, or you can find me on LinkedIn or other kind of platforms.
Fantastic. And if you would like to get in touch with us with your questions, comments, suggestions, or to come on to the show, you can reach us at cloudbusters@apptio.com. You can also join our LinkedIn group. Just do a quick search for Cloudbusters. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye, John.
Wow, he's just disappearing.
Travel safe.